Hi, so the person who handles this request is not available at the moment. Would you mind calling back later on today?
They are the lords of Hollywood for the most part, and they yield a lot of power. And God forbid you should buck that power, you will immediately be labeled as being anti-Semitic and not part of the crowd, the in crowd. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, the person who we're trying to reach, they're currently at lunchtime right now. Can you go ahead and call back a little after 2:30?
Movies are just entertainment. You know, don't take it too seriously. That is one of Hollywood's big lies.
Yeah, they're still not back from lunch.
Nepotism is hiring someone because they're family. Cronyism is hiring someone because they're friends. Favoritism is hiring someone because based on some arbitrary factor that you favor.
Well, it's just simply that we cannot accept unsolicited material.
What would be the reaction of many people in Hollywood today if all of a sudden we said, you know, 60% of the upper management in Hollywood and the top level executives are Christians? What would be the reaction to that?
Record your message at the tone. When you are finished, hang up.
As we covered in an earlier film entitled Cultural Marxism, The Corruption of America, the three best-known techniques from the Frankfurt School's social engineers are critical theory, cultural pessimism, and androgyny.
The United States has undergone a cultural, moral, and religious revolution. And a militant secularism has arisen in this country. It's always had a hold on the intellectual and academic elites. But in the 1960s, it captured the young in the universities and the colleges, and we had this great battle, cultural war begin then nationally. And since then, if you will, secularism has really achieved dominance in the academic community and the intellectual community and the entertainment community in Hollywood, among part of the political community, but not the nation as a whole. We won the Cold War with political and economic communism. We've lost the cultural war with cultural Marxism, which I think has prevailed pretty much in the United States, or is now the dominant culture, whereas those of us who are traditionalists, we are, if you will, the counterculture.
So Pat Buchanan is correct, of course. And as I discussed in yesterday's video, the three pillars of our culture that have been hijacked seem to be the mainstream media, academia, and Hollywood, which we knew based upon the intentions, the stated intentions of the Frankfurt School.
Today, corporate Hollywood extensively uses androgyny to indoctrinate the youth. In the simplest of terms, androgyny is the social science of making men into women and women into men. In other words, confusing men and women about their sexuality and their roles in society. The confusion is accomplished over decades of critical but subtle indoctrination about sexual identity and male-female roles.
Hollywood movies today provide a feeding ground for a lot of confusion and a lot of unnecessary false identities for particularly the youth of our country and the world today in terms of their own sexuality and their gender identification. We need to all be respectful of one another and not be judgmental. But when you get to a point where you're questioning which bathroom you should go into, it's really, frankly, in my opinion, reached the point of ridiculousness.
Put another way, almost all Hollywood movies, especially buddy films and coming-of-age films, promote the idea that homosexuality is as prevalent as heterosexuality. Hollywood movies make it all as normal as apple pie. Women going to the office, taking care of business instead of being at home, taking care of the kids. A continuous misrepresentation of traditional male-female roles to the impressionable youth of America.
What they're doing is they're trying to present the aberrant family, the dysfunctional family, as normal. That you should accept this, you should get used to this, you should embrace this, because this is just the way it's done everywhere. When children have the idea that dysfunction is normal, well then you are driving children into a mindset that they will act out those values and those principles which they've learned growing up.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of it is perpetrated by Hollywood celebrities, because they may feel that they're gay or bisexual or transgender, and they seem obsessed with promoting their activist agenda on the vast public. A public that is naive and is easily confused, particularly amongst young adults and teenagers and even middle schoolers.
Yes, the Long March has been very effective, and movies have led the way. Women endlessly assaulting and shooting males. Bad dads never at home, but out cheating with bad moms. Dysfunctional families with drug-infested kids. The message from Hollywood, the traditional family unit, parents and relationships suck. It's complicated.
It was the Frenchman de Tocqueville who came to our country, and he said, America is great because America is good. And if America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. So cultural Marxism is the introduction into America of pornography, drugs, counterculture type things. In other words, attack the Ten Commandments.
And almost every Hollywood movie carries all or part of this message as if it's some new production code or revenge on Will Hays.
Well, the Will Hays production code, actually that was the motion picture producers production code. And it was something that was developed from the 1920s onwards, eventually goes out in the late 50s, early 60s. It was designed to maintain certain ethical, political, moral, social standards within the filmmaking industry. That in the 1960s, you get people coming along in the production industry who say, well, we want to test the envelope here. We want to start talking about subjects that are outside of these limitations. Right? And they did. And they were essentially successful because the consumers were willing to watch these movies.
In the new code, every Hollywood movie must have characters with at least one of the following attributes. 1. The protagonist and/or antagonist are divorced. 2. The female is dominant, controlling, violent, and/or one-up on men. 3. The male is aloof, feminine, oversensitive, and/or cheating. 4. Somewhere in the family, at least one of the immediate members must be a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or radical women's liber. Often, attributes 1 through 4 are mixed with a touch of schizophrenia, stirred in as males and females swap roles in fluorescence.
The basic unit of a family is where a male as a sex joins with a female as a sex, and they're able to work together to help each other. And by being able to work together to help each other, they perfect each other, they love each other, they care for each other. And in the process, they learn to love and perfect and care for others within the society. They become good citizens because they're good citizens within their own home, and that produces a society that loves each other.
Again, through endless repetition, Hollywood movies have institutionalized every aspect of androgyny by depicting traditional families as abnormal.
One of the motives behind the common portrayal of a dysfunctional family unit that we see in so many motion pictures comes from the desire on the part of the creators of the movie to challenge the family unit. The family must be eliminated because as long as there's a family, people depend on each other and on the family rather than depending on the state, which means depending on those who rule the state. So I think people who are making motion pictures have probably somewhere along the line read some of these books about how evil the family is, and subconsciously perhaps, maybe consciously, they are writing scripts that portray the family to support this model.
I am now a teacher at a school, at a private school, and a survey was sent out not long ago. And the first question was their name. The second question was, which gender do you identify with? And you could identify with either male, female, or neither. Well, I think it's perpetrated confusion among so many people that it's been a very destructive thing in our culture.
Again, Hollywood movies have institutionalized every aspect of androgyny by depicting traditional families as abnormal. Only that which is politically correct is normal.
His schedule is pretty full, especially since we've just stopped shooting this year.
Another fetish of the new Hollywood is to defame senior citizens. Remember that 90-year-old woman who came on camera and cussed right in your face?
That asswipe also stiffed me for 2 months' rent when his deposit check bounced.
What purpose could that possibly serve except to invalidate the elderly who tend to respect traditional values? And the elderly are not the only ones. By age 20, our kids have been treated to thousands of movies defaming not just the elderly, but entire populations. Usually it's the Arab, the Muslim, the Latino, the Asian, German, Russian, or African American that's the bad guy in the movie.
Of course, you see a lot of Arabs and Muslims as bad guys in movies, Germans and Nazis as bad guys in movies. Almost to the extent, I mean, World War II seems to be the real, one of the real interests of Hollywood movies as opposed to other wars.
And the white guy from the American South, the Christian, the conservative, and the entrepreneur don't do much better.
We got a security problem here. This guy, he shouldn't be there, I know him.
Jerry? One of the movies that I saw years ago, it starred Robert Duvall, and it was Geronimo. And there was a scene in the movie that had Robert Duvall turn to his friends and he said, Texans are the lowest form of human life.
Must be Texans. Lowest form of white man there is.
What if a character in a movie said African Americans are the lowest form of human life? Or gays and lesbians were the lowest form of human life? Or what if they said Jews were the lowest form of human life? Would that be funny or offensive?
And at the Academy Awards, it's usually the same old group that gets the Oscars.
Well, I'm here at the Academy Awards, otherwise known as the White People's Choice Awards.
Never much diversity at the talent level because there's not much diversity at the executive level, the place where casting and financing decisions are made.
The control group only permits certain kind of movies to be made. Well, right there, it's basically limits the writers that are going to write these movies because they have to be in conformity with the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and biases of the control group. So descending from the lack of diversity at the control group level, we have a lack of diversity at all the other levels. Immediately, if you have the same people that are greenlighting movies and deciding what movies are going to be made, who's going to be in those movies, you're going to have a lack of diversity at the talent level. So the reason everyone in the Oscars is screaming about a lack of diversity at the talent level is because there's a lack of diversity at the executive level.
There are 0 African American studio heads in Hollywood.
But the problem is they're afraid to say that.
Doesn't a studio head have to greenlight? Don't we really need African-American stakeholders in the room?
No, you need people who will make, you need production companies that will make the movies.
The facile answer is that the makers of movies are the producers, writers, directors, actors, and crews. So let's take a look at the executive level and see why Hollywood movies have become so politically correct, even championing socialist and Marxist values with impunity.
Unavailable. Record your message at the tone.
If it's reasonable to theorize that movies tend to reflect the interests of their makers, why would anyone make a movie that didn't interest them, at least to some degree? If this makes sense, is it reasonable to further theorize that movies tend to mirror not only interests, but values, cultural perspectives, and even the prejudices of their makers?
And they also reflect the audience, because a film that doesn't connect with the audience in some way, doesn't really make much money.
Would Tolstoy's War and Peace have occurred had the Russian Revolution not occurred? Okay? So, does it reflect reality, or is it reality reflecting art? Okay? I think it's both.
Well, many of the producers of those movies would say that they are merely reflecting the dysfunctional families of society. I would argue that the abundance of movies that portray dysfunctional families is not consistent with the majority of the American public. It's not as much a reflection of society as it is an attempt by the Hollywood moguls to direct society into an amoral plane that they are choosing for society.
So let's break this down further. Again, the facile answer is that the makers of movies are the producers, writers, directors, actors, and crews. And this is true. These people are the wizards that technically make the movies. The manufacturing process of movies is extremely expensive. In fact, of all human art forms, the production of motion pictures is probably the most expensive. Today, the average cost of a major Hollywood movie is over $100 million, and some movies, such as Avatar and Star Wars, cost over $300 million. Given this, the people who finance movies are extremely important. In fact, if a movie can't be made unless it's financed, the people who finance movies may be more important than the producers, writers, directors, and actors who actually work on the project. If true, for all practical purposes, the makers of movies are the executives that select screenplays and finance their production.
One of the things you learn in the film industry is that writers are told, write what you know. Directors tend to direct movies that they're interested in. Studio executives tend to choose movies that interest them, that sort of align with their cultural perspective. And so anytime you have a narrow group of individuals who are in those control positions, which have the power to determine which movies are produced and released, then it's only natural that those movies tend to, over time, there are always exceptions, but tend to mirror the values, interests, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers, including the studio executives who choose which movies are made and who gets to work on those movies at the top level.
Thus, in reality, movies tend to reflect the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of the control group that makes them. But just knowing that the control group is comprised of the three top executives does not explain why Hollywood releases certain movies and suppresses others. We need to explore more closely what the Hollywood control group is interested in. If this can be answered, we should be able to more accurately induce the exact demographic of the control group. For again, movies reflect the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers.
The most accurate description of the people who control Hollywood and have for 115 years, it's a small group of politically liberal, not very religious Jewish males of European heritage. I think other people who are less accurate in their description are not doing anybody a favor by misstating the facts or just partially stating the facts.
Earlier, we touched on the observable fact that Hollywood's most blatant patterns of bias are racial, regional, religious, and political. Although Hollywood films originally took a more positive approach toward mainstream religious beliefs, after 1968, films generally began portraying an antagonistic anti-religious slant, especially toward Christianity.
Anything dealing with Christianity or Christ is kind of brushed aside when you've got someone like Mel Gibson who brings in millions, if not billions of dollars as a star, and yet the studios won't give him the money to make a kind of a poignant, beautiful movie about biblical history. And on the other hand, Schindler's List, that got all of the pomp and circumstance and all of the backing that was necessary. So maybe it's not quite as fairly balanced as it should be.
You know, Mel Gibson was determined to make that film knowing that the Hollywood establishment would never support it, would not fund it, in fact would actually do everything they could to stop it from being produced. And I think to the chagrin of the Hollywood elite, you know, The Passion of the Christ was one of the most successful, one of the most powerful movies that was ever made and will live in movie history forever.
Other than total bigotry towards certain religious groups, Hollywood movies constantly suppress themes that champion the nuclear family, a sound monetary system, non-interventionist foreign policies, free market capitalism, and the right to keep and bear arms. Such subjects are of little or no interest to the Hollywood control group and, in fact, threaten it.
Hollywood and the news media, the constant drumbeat is that we're in danger. And you can look at it like, almost like a sitcom or a soap opera. You know, you're being told every day that there's another boogeyman who's going to come and get you, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or active shooters. And almost all of these movies and shows will talk about, well, if things are bad enough, then you have to have martial law. There's never constitutional solutions like the people providing their own security. It's always more government power.
On the other hand, movies about travel, food, pets, Hitler, and the Nazis, most replete with nudity and the objectification of women, are of infinite interest to the Hollywood control group. Then there is the ongoing show known as the War on Terror, featuring real-life Arabs and Muslims as the bad guys.
I think the War on Terror can be correctly described as a show, because I don't think it's real. It's not to say that terror is not real, because it is. What it is to say is that it's not what we think it is, and its origin is not what we think it is. Terrorism is largely the product of the people and groups that benefit from fighting terrorism.
The War on Terror is a $4.5 trillion waste of money. We've lost our civil liberties through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. All of this goes back to 9/11, and the heart of that matter is at the World Trade Center. If there's any question about what happened, then we've got to focus in on it with laser beam attention.
Hollywood movies today, I'm not so sure in the past, but certainly today, they tend to reflect the goals and the policies of the upper levels of the political system. They tend to be mouthpieces, basically speaking, for Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is promoting the War on Terror. Washington, D.C. developed the Department of Homeland Security in response to the declaration of the War on Terror. And so it's not surprising that Hollywood would glorify that.
And with the War on Terror, Hollywood movies, along with their buddies and the rest of the mainstream media, feel justified in promoting endless paranoia, hence endless need for more security. Now, local police, the National Guard, the FBI, the CIA, the Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force are not enough. We now also need the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security, a police force modeled after Heinrich Himmler's Department of National Security.
If we don't know what a police state is, watch the news.
If you want to know what a police state is, go through an airport and be frisked and have the TSA stick their hands down your pants, claiming that you are a suspect with no evidence. The police state is where everyone is guilty until proven innocent.
So, thanks to Hollywood's endless parade of violence-oriented, terror-ridden movies, we now need endless security in our streets, our restaurants, security at our schools, at the mall, in our homes, even at the toilet, a buzzer with a direct line to 911. And New York City, where so much of this security is now found, is becoming more of a police state every day.
That's unnecessary. I see the media as actually, the mainstream media as being much more like a movie these days. It's so unreal that it has to be a movie. They are completely scripted, and even the people, the anchors and the people that sit behind the desk and read the stories don't appear to be very human. It has just escalated more and more. I find them completely creating a bizarre reality, if you will, because I don't really see them as reality. And if they are, if that is reality, that is pretty frightening to me.
Stop and frisk, police and cameras everywhere, walls and barricades all over. Why would anyone want to attack New York City, one of the largest gun-free zones in America? Oh, wait, the bad guys already have attacked it, twice.
You read the Declaration of Independence, we're living under the exact same type of tyrannical rule, but in some cases it's even worse. We have hordes of bureaucrats out there eating out our substance. A police state isn't just uniformed officers running checkpoints on the highway. It's bureaucrats forcing their way into your home. It's oppressive tax surveillance systems that track everything you do. A police state is what we see America rapidly segueing into today.
So if movies mirror their makers, what kind of a maker would put out movies about endless wars, endless violence, and the need for endless security, other than a group of paranoid studio and network execs that have defamed almost every population on Earth just to make a profit or to promote an agenda?
Please state your name and why you're calling one more time, please.
Yes, the Hollywood studios vilify anything corporate or capitalist. Indeed, Karl Marx, one of Hollywood's A-list writers, made capitalism his #1 enemy. It's therefore no surprise that the #1 swear word in Hollywood is profit, and the #2 swear word is corporation. Is it thus any surprise that almost every Hollywood movie also makes the greedy, profit-driven corporation the bad guy, and the Uncle Sam government the good guy? Atlas Shrugged, a pro-corporation movie based on a best-selling book, was turned down by the Hollywood Control Group for decades.
Ayn Rand wrote a book called Atlas Shrugged. This book was kicking around Hollywood for decades and decades. Even though it was a bestseller, nobody in Hollywood wanted to make it. Why? Because it makes the corporation the good guy. And as we know, in every Hollywood movie, the corporation is the bad guy, and the government is the good guy. The mom and pop government is the good guy, coming running in with the sticker on their back that says FBI, they saved the day. So Ayn Rand's great book, Atlas Shrugged, sat on the shelf for decades and decades. And everybody else was making every other movie bashing corporations, from RoboCop on down to James Cameron's Avatar. I mean, here we not only have corporations in America that are evil, the corporations all over the universe and solar system are evil.
Their damn village happens to be resting on the richest unobtainium deposit within 200 clicks in any direction. I mean, look at all that cheddar.
So Ayn Rand dared to make a movie where the corporation wasn't the evil guy, and Hollywood just cannot have something like that.
If the project does not mirror the interests, values, cultural perspectives, or prejudices of the makers, it does not get made in Hollywood. and movies about good corporations do not interest the Hollywood Control Group. Interestingly, profit does interest the Hollywood Control Group, but only if it's their profit and its acquisition does not interfere with the control group's political or religious bias. This is why Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, was not financed by a major studio, even though Gibson is an A-list talent, and his previous pictures have garnered over $1.5 billion in revenues for the MPAA studio distributors.
Movies like that and anything to do with, has any biblical context or any kind of a spiritual message, the studios simply, for the most part, don't get behind.
All said, Hollywood's ostensible disdain for profit and corporations is disingenuous, if not ironic, for the studios, networks, and their parent conglomerates are some of the most profitable corporations on the planet. Accordingly, executives garner some of the highest salaries in the world.
Well, there is a lot of money being made in Hollywood, and it's reported all the time in the press. And a lot of the studio executives and a lot of the top talent are paid significant amount of money, unbelievable amounts of money. But I don't think it's fair to say, well, that's a bribe for being quiet. On the other hand, it is fair to observe that people who are paid a lot of money for what they do tend not to complain.
For instance, in 2014, Rupert Murdoch, CEO of 21st Century Fox, earned $29.2 million. Brian Roberts, CEO of Comcast, earned $31.4 million. Jeffrey Bukes, CEO of Time Warner, earned $32.5 million. Robert Iger, CEO of Disney, earned $34.3 million. And Phillips Dahlman, CEO of Viacom, earned $37.2 million. And thanks to the star system and its greedy, rude agents, A-list stars routinely get $20 million per picture. Some more, like Robert Downey Jr., who got $75 for Iron Man, and Leonardo DiCaprio, who got $25 million for The Wolf of Wall Street, another capitalist-loathing movie that dramatizes how big and bad corporations are.
Salaries are certainly not necessarily in Hollywood commensurate with talent or being deserving. Same thing's true on Wall Street. The salaries are totally disproportionate to, you know, the real worth of the talent or the studio head.
So the idea that the movie business is a risky business is simply a conspiracy theory. The Hollywood corporations make as much or more money than any of the big, mean corporations it endlessly depicts.
And a very small portion of the pie, you know, goes to the real creative people who are trying to, you know, present their artistry as best they can, because the bigger portion of the pie goes to the moguls.
And there are hundreds of ways the Hollywood Control Group not only profits, but maintains control over all aspects of its empire. For instance, ever hear of creative accounting or contracts of adhesion?
Creative accounting, this is a term that most of us have heard, and what does it mean? It simply means that instead of following carefully mapped out acceptable standards, known as GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Practices, which is used by the whole world, it just basically means that you bring in your accountants and you just let it wing, let it fly, you know, just put the numbers wherever you want and subtract this and deduct that and capitalize whatever you want, expense what you want, anything you can think of to be creative. And you know, if anyone wants to argue with you, then that means they have to go hire their $300 an hour accountant and argue with you. So the studio will sit there and they will fight you with their $300 an hour accountants, and the amount of money you thought you were cheated out of will be basically equal to the amount of money that you will have spent on your $300 an hour accountant.
Hundreds of predatory, unethical, and often illegal business practices used by the Hollywood Control Group over the decades to enrich themselves and to send everyone else into bankruptcy.
Here's what Hollywood tends to do when it loses in court, and I've seen this in several instances. They simply modify their behavior a little bit. not too much. So block booking is a situation where a distributor goes to an exhibitor. The distributor is represented by an individual, exhibitor is represented by an individual. They're friends, they know each other. They meet and barbecue in their backyard, and they have an informal conversation that goes something like this. Hey, you know, we've got this blockbuster coming down the pipeline here in the next 6 months, and if you'd like to get that, we'd appreciate it if you'd run these other 2 films too, one of which is okay and the other one's probably not very good. So in my judgment, block booking is alive and well, it's just not formal.
Practices that include unjust enrichment, David Begelman-style embezzlement, reciprocal preferences, cross-collateralization, turnaround, conflicts of interest, false accusations of anti-Semitism, blacklisting, concept theft, monkey points, inflated budgets, contracts of adhesion.
A contract of adhesion occurs when the bargaining parties are basically totally disproportionate. You have a multi-billion-dollar studio basically contracting with a starving writer. The multi-billion-dollar studio is in a position to basically say to the starving writer, here's your contract, take it or leave it. We're paying you $10.99 for your script, take it or leave it. And then suddenly the screenplay produces a movie that makes $1 billion. Okay, so the next time then the studio comes back to the writer and says, hey, will you write another screenplay for us? And the writer says, sure, but I'm charging $10 million for this screenplay.
Contrary to arguments of Hollywood apologists, the cultural Marxist-infected control group does not maintain power because it's smarter than anyone else or more able than anyone else. It maintains power because it uses predatory, unethical, and illegal business practices better than anyone else. It also pushes power to only its circle of insiders.
Employment discrimination can be looked at in 2 ways. It can be looked at in a good way. I am going to discriminate between 2 individuals applying for a job because individual A has superior background, skills, and so forth and so on to individual B. So I am clearly discriminating in that case. Discrimination in the undesirable case, socially undesirable, politically undesirable case, is where I choose individual A over individual B because of some characteristic of individual A or B that's completely unrelated to the performance of the job.
We'd like to supply you with a home of your own, a car, a generous bank account, and employment with our company.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that some of the studio executives and people who are in high positions in Hollywood are somewhat lucky in the sense that they might have been born into the right family that had family ties to the film industry over the years. After all, there's you know, some of the same families and some of the same cultural cousins or people with a similar background have dominated that industry for over 115 years. And in my view, that's impossible without mass discrimination occurring over this period of time. And this discrimination occurs specifically in the form of nepotism, cronyism, and favoritism.
It's thus no wonder almost every corporation depicted in a Hollywood movie is evil and profit-driven. Hollywood wrote the book on the subject. Now it's dramatizing its own corporate behavior.
Sorry, is unavailable. Record your message at the tone. When you are finished.
Thanks to the responsible creative control exercised by the original movie moguls throughout Hollywood's golden era, the studios profited by making creative movies that were on a wide spectrum of subjects, as discussed by Ethan Mordden in his book, The Hollywood Studios. But today, the corporatized Marxists that infest Hollywood put out any agenda-promoting movie that will make a profit, regardless of how crude, disgusting, exploitive, or puerile the movie is. Ask the executives that greenlit Dirty Grandpa.
You want me to do your back?
Only if you promise to do my front first.
Gladly. Oh, whoops. That never usually happens.
Really, it happens to me all the time.
And needless to say, the #1 element in many Hollywood movies is violence, because violence sells, especially in international markets, where the streets now look little different than Hollywood movie sets.
Movies have become actually pretty boring because they're all violent right now, and I remember a time when they were more psychological thrillers. I liked those, the English Gothic films, and then At some point, I would say probably in the late 70s, they moved over from the Twilight Zones and the Night Gallery and you know, the Vincent Price type of films to just complete bloodlust, and there was really nothing to figure out in that, and it has just escalated more and more. I find it so unreal that it has to be a movie.
And in today's world, the role models that are being offered to the young people are not necessarily the white hats at all.
No dickhead!
They're cynical people. A lot of them have criminal instincts. A lot of them are doing very bad things, and they have, on screen, they show no scruples, they show no compassion, they show no morals, no ethics, and yet they are the role models.
Come to Dad.
Many of these characters are violent, and that's what makes them, you know, big tough guys. They're really good guys because they're violent. And so that's the image that's being presented, and I think that it has created a generation or more of people who are not sensitive anymore to violence.
I love movie violence. I know that might seem a little strange, but I'm just being honest with myself. You aren't messed up because you make a film about killing. You're messed up if you actually kill.
Yes, the very studio executives that say they are concerned about so much violence in the world and who advise we never forget the Holocaust profit by selling violence to every corner of the world. Is it any wonder the planet is so war-torn? If movies reflect their makers' interests, why are the makers so interested in violence? Does Hollywood breed global violence and terror? Many feel it does. It certainly profits from global violence and terror. Jack Valenti, past president of the MPAA, said that movies are mere entertainment. Is he right? Are movies mere entertainment? Entertainment that happens to reflect the violent world in which we live? Not according to 1,000 studies that have come out over the past 40 years. According to them, movies cause violence.
You see active shooters on the screen, then you get copycats who decide they want to go out like that, they want to be famous. And of course the media, when it's an active shooter, instead of withholding the guy's name and denying him that fame, they instead put his name and his face all over the cameras, and that just makes them want to do more of that. If someone's unstable and wants to go out and be in the history books, they know that they can count on the media to put their face and their name all over the place and pass it back and forth, 24/7.
By the time our children are 18 years old, they have seen over 20,000 murders and 200,000 violent acts in the movies.
And part of the reason is that feeds the bigger agenda, curtail your right to bear arms, curtail your freedom, have more surveillance of all of us.
The violence in movies affects the child's brain. When there's a lot of killing in movies, children don't see that there's a consequence to it. And often the villains that are portrayed are stereotyped. You could take whatever's bugging the government or some particular group of people and put them as the villain, and then there you go. You start conditioning the person that this particular group of people is dangerous.
Thanks to Hollywood, our kids have learned to not only hate old people and dads, but moms, families, girlfriends, boyfriends, seniors, Latinos, Arabs, Muslims, Asians, Germans, blacks, Christians, conservatives, profit corporations, free markets, competition, capitalism, and even the U.S. Constitution.
The first principle in the U.S. Constitution is limited government. And it's certainly not my perception that what is coming out of Hollywood today in any way champions limited government. If anything, it champions the extension of government in whatever area you can imagine, from the war on terror on the one side to government intervention in public education, healthcare, and so forth and so on. There's very little that comes out of Hollywood that you could say is informed by the principles of the Founding Fathers. So if you look at it from the terms of those principles, I would say no, Hollywood generally does not support the United States Constitution.
Our kids have also learned how to be stress-free on the pharmaceutical drugs advertised endlessly on network TV while mass murdering their classmates in the Hollywood-promoted public school system. How does this happen? Ben Badikian, author of The New Media Monopoly, says bluntly that media power is political power.
Aren't there examples, and might not Brooke Shields be an example of someone who benefited from one of those drugs?
All it does is mask the problem. You're here on the Today Show.
Right.
And to talk about it in a way of saying, well, isn't it okay, and being reasonable about it when you don't know.
I've lived with these people, and they're better.
So you're advocating it?
I am not. I'm telling you, in their case, in their individual case, it worked.
Drugs aren't the answer. That these drugs are very dangerous. They're mind-altering, antipsychotic drugs.
Most politicians never criticize the mainstream media. They know the New York or Hollywood control group can make or break their careers.
Well, I think it's self-evident that media power, in the broadest sense of media, is political power, because how does one obtain political power in a democratic system where you're trying to influence voters? It's through their interaction with news, entertainment, opinion leaders, if you will. And how do those interactions occur? Well, it's through some form of media, whether in the 19th century it was newspapers, and in the 20th century comes radio, television, motion pictures, internet. So the more a particular political point of view is able to operate through those media and influence individuals, the more that political point of view will tend to gain prominence and control.
We don't accept any unsolicited materials. I'm getting a call on the other line. Can you hold for 1 second?
And speaking of careers, Hollywood is the only industry in the world that has enslaved its unions and guilds.
Any union or guild is supposed to serve the interests of workers, and it should be open to all workers. But that's not the way it is in Hollywood. In Hollywood, the unions and the guilds are basically under the domination of the studios. And by that, I mean that they act as the screening agents for the studios. The agents also act as screening agents for the studios, and this would include the agents that are signatory to the Writers Guild.
Sure, the unions and guilds are there to protect the workers' careers, but only a handful of workers, the ones that get to work on signatory productions.
Very difficult as to talk about who they actually serve. If you go up and audition for a film, if you're not in the Screen Actors Guild, your agents probably can't get you in the door. So you have to hope that you meet somebody along the line that says, listen, I want to give this kid a break. And then you get a job for a minimal amount of money, but you get your SAG card, your Screen Actors Guild card.
In effect, the unions and guilds sign contracts with the studios that result in a soft collusion that bars millions of workers from employment in the motion picture industry. These so-called signatory productions thus form a cartel of discrimination that screens out talented new actors, writers, crew members, and filmmakers with a sophisticated network of carefully designed catch-22s. For instance, production agreements stipulate that one can't work on a signatory production unless they're in the union or guild. But one can't get in the union or guild unless they have worked on a signatory production.
It's a catch-22 because you can't really do a union film if you're not in the union, and you're not allowed to really do non-union work, so it's very difficult. They keep a lot of people out. It's hard to earn your stripes and get that first break as a cinematographer or as an actor or whatnot, you know, in a movie or a TV show.
And ever try submitting a screenplay to Hollywood or one of its nasty agents? It's almost impossible unless you know someone. Yes, at the advice of their paranoid lawyers, the new Hollywood studio executives now accept no unsolicited screenplays from the thousands of talented authors and writers across the nation. And even if you call one of the studios, agents, or signatory production companies to query them for interest, a time-honored practice, they consider that very call unsolicited.
Well, it's just simply that we cannot accept unsolicited material.
In other words, they got to call you up and go, yo, James, we hear you got a whole bunch of scripts out there. Let's let's start sending these puppies in. We need some scripts here at ABC Studios. Unless you put out a best-selling book and you're a best-selling author, Hollywood is not going to solicit your screenplay.
And good luck getting anyone on the phone. You can't even talk to anyone at a studio unless you know the specific name of the person you're calling. Yes, writers with fresh, original concepts or a diversity of unique stories can go to hell as far as the Hollywood studios are concerned. The Hollywood Control Group makes sure only its little bevy of studio-approved, union-bribed writers get the job.
Nepotism, cronyism, and favoritism are simply forms of discrimination that have been used in Hollywood over the years to maintain control over the industry for, again, over 100 years, which I think is an absolute impossibility without discrimination. So nepotism is hiring someone because they're family. Cronyism is hiring someone because they're friends. Favoritism is hiring someone based on some arbitrary factor that you favor. And in this sense, it tends to be people who are like the people who are in control.
Is it any wonder almost every Hollywood movie is a clone of almost every other Hollywood movie?
If you limit the number of writers that you are willing to employ, you're going to limit the number of stories that are being told. And in my view, you're going to limit the breadth of the viewing audience that you can attract to your films. I suppose that people interested in ownership control want to limit the writing staff in order to control the messages that are being sent out in their productions, but it also may limit the size of the viewership and therefore limit the revenue that your pictures bring in.
And want to produce a movie in Hollywood? Surprise! The star system is there to drive you crazy and then suck every penny from your bank account before spitting you out. In short, a studio won't finance your project unless you have one of its overly paid name talents officially attached.
You've got to get a director, a name director attached to it, or a name movie star. And that's really, really difficult. So as a result of that, there's a lot of really talented projects that might come to fruition and be incredibly successful projects never get to see the light of day.
But here's the catch-22. A named talent won't officially attach unless the project is already set up, studio speak for financed. Thus, in order to get a movie financed in the new Hollywood's star system, you have to already have financed the movie yourself with outsider money. In short, the publicly owned movie corporations discriminate against the public by refusing to do business with anyone who is not a Hollywood insider.
It could be argued that in a free society, you should be free to discriminate any way you wish, as long as you don't injure a person. But in a broader sense, we all should seek to be discriminate. We need to choose. We don't want to just choose our friends. Put up values there and stick by them and pass by people that don't meet your values and your criteria. That's a good thing. So it depends on how the word discrimination is used, and in the field of Hollywood, I suppose you could argue it either way.
Many of Hollywood's business practices amount to blatant discrimination and restraint of trade, and this is why a serious lack of diversity exists at every level of the movie industry.
Restraint of trade is any limitation on trade using the free market as the standard. Are we preventing consumers from exercising real choice over products? Are we preventing producers from offering products to consumers?
One doesn't have to be Nostradamus to predict that most of the people that work on the Hollywood movies are not Latino, not Arabs or Muslims, not blacks, Asians, or females, not Christians, and especially not conservatives. And guess what? You can be sure the control group is no different, because all of the employment discrimination descends from the control group itself.
The phrase lack of diversity, which I use in my writing, is simply talking about the fact that there are not a lot of different kinds of people, racial, ethnic, gender, at the top in Hollywood. As I said, we're talking about 2% women. I think one African American, there were no African Americans in my original study, one maybe since then in those studio head positions, or those top 3 studio positions. No Latino, one Latino I think in my study, out of 226 people. No Native Americans, no Asian Americans. That's a real lack of diversity in Hollywood.
In summary, with the demise of the studio system, Hollywood's modus operandi has been to circle the wagons, build huge walls with guarded gates, and establish a bunker mentality that rejects not only all the unsolicited screenplays, but all unsolicited people, places, and things. Hollywood even rejects the very concept of diversity itself, and this is why everyone is screaming at the Oscars.